our panel, are going to offer you some perspectives on the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, a much underreported story in the media here and around the world. I came, as Orest explained, out to Ukraine in early April. I came to coordinate a technical assistance mission and assistance, and found a developing humanitarian crisis that now involves hundreds of thousands of people. No one was prepared for that humanitarian crisis. Not the Ukrainian government, not the international community. We lacked institutions, organizational and coordination mechanisms. We did not have the laws we needed to respond. We did not have the expertise on the ground to respond to a humanitarian crisis of this scale. And it took time to set all of that up. In the meantime, however, it was the Ukrainian civil society that were the first responders. Businesses, churches, NGOs, municipalities. And for the first, into the fall, they were overwhelmingly the people who were responding to the needs of these people who were displaced or were hunkering down in the middle of a battlefield. By about the fall of 2014, 6 months or so in, the international community was making an impact, and that was important because the winter was coming. And now, that international community and the Ukrainians themselves are much better organized. We have the mechanisms in place and the people in place to deliver material and health care and meet the other needs, the multiple needs that these people have. Unfortunately, the response from the international community in terms of resources has not been adequate, as earlier speakers have said. The UN humanitarian appeal of last year was only met by about 55% of the funding that was requested. The appeal this year, in 2016, is for almost $300 million. Very little of that money has been received. Let me, with that, and I'll also point out that the conflict is not ceasing. It's continuing, and if anything, it has ticked up in the first months of this year. So with that sort of setting it up, let me turn to our panelists to give you their perspective. I'm going to suggest we go right down the row here, starting with Dawn, who worked on the field, on the ground there, and can give you one perspective of it. Ambassador Verveer and the doctor another. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dawn.
Thank you. I'm with Refugees International and was privileged to go to Ukraine last summer and spend some time there meeting with the government and NGOs. And as the ambassador said, the amazing response of civil society for individual Ukrainians to the needs of their fellow Ukrainians was simply amazing. And it's a response that continues. The difficulty is that we know that 800,000 to 1 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. What does that mean? They lost their homes, their jobs, they lost their access to institutions, their churches, their cemeteries, their neighborhood associations, and they're trying to make a go of it. Most of them are living doubled up or tripled up with other families. Many have been taken in by Ukrainians who they did not know before. Of course, many are with family and friends. But it's getting tougher and tougher to survive. The economy, as you know, is very bad. The GDP lost about 10% last year. It's supposed to be a little better this year. And as the ambassador said, the UN has finally figured out how to work in Ukraine, which is basically to fund local organizations and to try to get the money out directly to the people who need it the most. And so for last year, for the winterization program, and we had a terrible winter this year, as you all know. In January, we had lots of sub-zero temperatures, and we had cases of hypothermia, and we had deaths, unfortunately, from people who had no coal, no wood, no gas, no water, no electricity. And those conditions, unfortunately, continue. The international community, as the ambassador said, figures they need about $398 million to reach 2.5 million Ukrainians in need. All of those are not internally displaced. About 200,000 are along the line of contact, the so-called gray zone, which is supposedly a demilitarized area, but which unfortunately still continues to get shelling and is peppered with landmines and unexploded ordnance. And every month, unfortunately, people are injured from landmines, from touching unexploded ordnance, and a number of those people injured are children, and those are traumatic injuries. The UN is working also with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and unfortunately, in the conflict, as I mentioned last fall, the would-be authorities in the separatist areas in Luhansk and Donetsk required all of the humanitarian agencies to register with them, and they would decide who could operate on their territory. And at one point, they even kicked out the United Nations, which is very unusual from my experience in lots of other places during difficult times. The UN and a number of countries went to bat and tried to encourage, obviously, the Russian government to lean on their subordinates, or friends, or whatever you want to call them, to let the humanitarian agency resume their work. The UN was eventually allowed to come back, but their partners, the implementing agencies who really go out into the communities, were, for the most part, have not been allowed to go back. So small non-governmental organizations in the non-government controlled area continue to do a lot of the humanitarian work, but they need resources. We're very concerned that the lawless conditions that prevail, unfortunately, in the non-government controlled area have gotten worse and not better. So there are disappearances, there's lack of a rule of law, and there's a scarcity of needed goods, particularly medicines and foodstuffs. The government of Ukraine has done a number of very good things, but it's also, in my view, has done a lot of bad things. And sometimes you wonder which side is operating, the good side or the bad side. It imposed restrictions on freedom of movement that affect both the UN and civilians who try to cross back and forth into the non-government controlled area or to the government controlled area. The government obviously cut off all pensions and payments into the non-government controlled areas. In November of 2014, the Rada passed an IDP law. It wasn't perfect, but it was a very good start. And this last December, they made amendments to that law that would help unaccompanied children and help people whose documents had been destroyed or lost in their flight. And any of you who have been in conditions where there's been a fire in your house or an explosion in the neighborhood know what happens. You run, you take your children, maybe if you're lucky, you take your pets, and you leave everything else behind, money, goods. And how do people survive? The government of Ukraine set up a small system to provide stipends, very small amounts, but modest amounts to people who were internally displaced. About 500,000 people applied for those stipends. Last December, as I said, the Rada looked at the IDP law and fixed it to be more in conformity with international guiding principles and international customs. Unfortunately, on February 16th, the government of Ukraine, without notice, cut off IDP registrations of 250,000 to 500,000 people. We don't know how. The NGOs and the human rights organizations in Ukraine are very concerned that it didn't follow the rules and procedures that are set out in the IDP law and under the Constitution of Ukraine. They are attempting to go into court to sue and to find the grounds on which these cutoffs occurred. The Ministry of Social Policy reports, which is responsible at this point for verifying where the people are living, reports that it doesn't have the staff or the resources to go out and check up on 500,000 people, which is understandable. The government is concerned about fraud, which is obviously something they need to be concerned about. But at the same token, there's no denial that these are Ukrainian citizens who are desperately in need of assistance. And so we're concerned that the government continues its policies of the past system to cross back and forth. Over 400,000 people cross every year back and forth between the non-government controlled areas and the government controlled areas. Of those people, 400 cars a day, there are only 4 crossing points. The UN is limited, and the humanitarian agencies bringing relief are limited to using those same crossing points, which are often closed and have long backlogs, queues of 400 cars where you could wait 8 to 10 to 15 hours. Old people stay all night to be able to go across to visit their relatives or friends or bring food. The government limits how much food can be brought by a visitor into the non-government controlled areas and what kind of goods. The UN is very concerned that water pumps are needed in a number of places. Repairs need to be made to electric lines and pylons, and that requires negotiation between the two sides and the presence usually of the Office of Security and Europe's special monitoring mission, so that they can negotiate a truce, so they can do the repairs that would make it possible to restore water and electricity and gas services. Obviously, without water, it's very difficult to live. The UN agencies and NGOs are providing water supplies, by bottled water, tankers, etc., off and on to several 100,000 people at any one time. But that's only a temporary measure. The water lines need to be fixed. So what should we all be doing? I did a PowerPoint. I don't know where it is. Here we are. It's up there, if you don't mind. So right now we have about 40 million. This is a study that was done by a number of NGOs, only on the government side of Ukraine, showing that there are 76,000 Ukrainians living in totally inadequate shelter. What does that mean? That means no running water, no bathrooms in some cases, no insulation, totally overcrowded facilities. And you can see where this, unfortunately, is not limited to just one area of Ukraine. Obviously, the largest concentration of internally displaced people and people affected by the war are along the border there with Luhansk and Donetsk. That's an extremely, I visited that area extensively when I was in Ukraine, and there are lots of small communities that are determined to hold on, who leave when the area is attacked or shelled and then come back as soon as they can. A number of people were going back last summer despondent because they couldn't find jobs, they couldn't find housing that they could afford, even with the very minor, small IDP payments they were getting. And so some of them were going back into Donetsk and Luhansk, the non-government controlled areas, because they didn't see any ability to survive, and they had other family back in those areas who they hoped would help them. If you show the next slide, please. This is a lady we accompanied. Her house had been shelled. Her son was a war veteran and had died of an illness, and she lost everything. But she was determined. She was staying. She was living with her sister and her sister's children. There were 14 of them living in a one-bedroom apartment in Mariupol. But of the people killed and injured, obviously every time someone is killed, the whole family suffers. Every time someone is wounded, a whole family suffers. And then, unfortunately, the woundings and the deaths continues, as the ambassador said. So thousands of homes and apartments, schools and businesses have been destroyed or severely damaged. The people have lost jobs, businesses have had to close, and obviously whole industries have been affected. An interesting study was done this summer, which basically points out that the largest single investment coming into Ukraine is from remittances from workers. Not from banks, not from the private sector, but remittances from workers who are overseas. Next slide, please. My concern is that we need to take care of the immediate humanitarian needs of the people, so access to food, water, shelter, children's ability to go to school. UNICEF, with the EU funding, is going to do a great program to help the educational system in Ukraine deal with the needs of families that have been affected by the war, the children who've seen terrible things, and to help them understand the normal reactions of stress that one has in these situations and how they can best cope and how they can help their families to survive. But we also have to start thinking about building. In my view, Ukraine is a country where internal displacement could be solved. The local governors, the mayors that we met with, and village administrators talked about empty buildings that they could renovate to make new housing. They talked about how easy it would be and how much more preferable than bringing in more trailers, which the Germans have very generously contributed, about 2,000, at a cost of about $8,000 each trailer, that they could renovate whole buildings and whole communities, and people would live in normal kinds of housing. But none of that investment has come yet. And that's what I think we need to think about. So we need humanitarian assistance, but we also need what I call early recovery money, money that will make it possible for people to have jobs, for infrastructure to be repaired, and for people to feel that they have hope. This is a house that's being repaired because in Mariupol, the Rada made a special program so that they would help the people whose homes had been damaged to be repaired. That's the only place in Ukraine where that has happened. And as you remember, Mariupol was shelled continuously for days and days. And they're still shelling in Shirokna. But Ukrainians who've lost their businesses and whose homes have been damaged and apartments are waiting to see when the government will start a program to help them too be able to repair their homes and to return home. The next slide. Progress and obstacles. So I talk about the order by the freedom of movement. Pretty soon it'll be easier for Ukrainians to go to Europe and to the EU countries than it will be to go to the non-government controlled areas, because they're going to get freedom. The EU is going to give them access. In February, Minsk II was signed. We've had these signatures and the hopes that things would change. Unfortunately, in May, hostilities increased. In July, as I told you, the de facto authorities kicked the UN and NGOs out. In September, there was a new ceasefire. Children were able to go back to school. It was wonderful. But a lot of families complained to me that there were so many checkpoints that their children had to go to, those who lived near the line of contact, that their kids couldn't get to school on time, nor could their husbands get to work. In November, the UN was finally able to do some distributions of food and medicines and materials to do some emergency repairs of shelter in November. In December, hostilities picked up again, and the number of people trying to cross the contact line increased substantially. January was again a lull, Christmas, New Year, a lull in the fighting. And we had a ceasefire with a ceasefire, and we had an agreement to do something about landmines and unexploded ordnance, and to try and to work more effectively to protect people from the scourges that will continue for years in Ukraine. In February, another checkpoint was closed, which made it again more difficult for people to travel. And in March, February, March, as I said, the government cut off social payments to so many IDPs. And the NGOs and the UN so far have not been able to determine on what basis that was done, and why the Ministry of Social Policy got a list and was told to do this. So we think that the government of Ukraine has got to rethink some of its policies, and particularly the cutoff of the IDP payments. Secondly, the whole question of freedom of movement inside the country, because this is all Ukraine. And thirdly, think about how it can begin building now for the future, to restore jobs, to help people restore their housing, and to give them hope instead of despair. Last slide. As far as I'm concerned, the future of Ukraine is obviously up to the Ukrainians, but it's also up to all of us to make people be aware of what's going on in the country, and to make them aware of how much Ukrainians have suffered so far and how much they've been willing to do. There's been no reluctance of Ukrainians to volunteer for national defense, to go into the military, to do medical aid, volunteer psychologists, volunteer therapists. And there's been no reluctance of Ukrainian people to suffer, to stand up for their rights. Someone today in a meeting I was at earlier said, Ukraine is a new country in the last 2 years. And I think that's true. And I hope you can help tell the story of the new Ukraine and the role that it can play and should play in international development. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Don gave us a very comprehensive understanding of precisely what's happening in this humanitarian crisis. And I think what I want to say at the outset is that in many ways, this crisis seems invisible. It certainly seems invisible in much of the world. It's off the front pages or off the headlines that pop up in social media, and in some other ways. And if something is invisible, it really makes it much more difficult to get the kind of response that's critically needed. So I think we have to keep in mind always the magnitude of this and ways in which to describe that, so that the large number of activists, from decision makers to people who have that willing spirit, will continue to be engaged. There is no doubt that the magnitude of the crisis remains enormous. I have been to Ukraine twice, most recently a few days ago, over the last several months, and I am constantly struck by the reminders, even in everyday life, away from the war zone, of how prominent this is on people's minds, the repercussions that they're being affected by in a multitude of ways, and the fact that this is as real as anything that can be experienced. Obviously, as Don said, the desperate need for shelter, medical supplies, food, jobs, that continues in very serious ways. I heard the most harrowing stories about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children in real dire circumstances. Often their situations exacerbated by the kinds of constraints on freedom of movement for others to come in, to enable them to move from where they are in ways that Don described. And I think it's important to bear in mind that this affects the war zone, the ceasefire line, the internally displaced wherever they find themselves, and repercussions on the rest of the people in the country more broadly. There are also tensions between those who have been displaced and the host communities. And that's understandable because many of those communities are under extreme strains without the fact that they are now having those strains exacerbated. And in fact, a group of parliamentarians with whom I met said to me, are there ways in which you can help us understand how we can help the host communities and the displaced who move into them, how we can learn from other experiences in comparable situations as to how that's been dealt with. So real time, real concerns. The other aspect of this, I think it's important to bear in mind, is that what was just described so comprehensively by Don is also exacerbated by the continuing conditions of the economy, which are very real. The fact that corruption truly needs to be addressed, confronted. The reforms that have taken place need to be implemented because that also takes a toll on the lives of the people. And the fact that the ceasefire continues to be violated. So again, this multitude of factors that explains much of the picture that we have to truly understand in all of its magnitude. I think, as Don said, that the humanitarian crisis really does call for a greater international role, but it also means that the government's got to do a better job in coordinating all that needs to be done and understand how one piece of this impacts another. As you heard, civil society, and you know this well, the religious community, so many other actors have been rallying from the first days when this aggression occurred to the present day. And conditions are ones where the strain is really beginning to show. And this is the kind of work that cannot be done just by civil society, cannot be done just by the international community. It needs a real coordinated approach, and the Ukrainian government has to be at the center of that. There are very big issues, including housing and jobs and the kind of domestic violence that even gets exacerbated by these kinds of tensions. And another contributing aspect to this is the reintegration of the soldiers and those volunteers who are now coming back, and all of the needs that they have build on conditions that are less than optimal, to be sure. Ukraine, as you know well, is endowed with many extraordinary local organizations with large assets in terms of human capacity, in terms of know-how and skills. I think they need to be engaged in more serious ways by the donor community. And certainly the local and regional authorities that you've heard about, in addition to the national authorities, have to come in to begin to address the kind of recovery that one needs to see, and also create those sustainable solutions to some of the bigger issues that are going to be long-term coming out of this. I want also to say something about the women of Ukraine. They have been acted differently, they have been affected differently by the war, as always happens with war. Women and children bear huge tolls in ways that their male counterparts don't always necessarily. They are the great majority of the internally displaced, and many have lost their livelihoods. Many have assumed the breadwinning roles in society. Violence against women in the war zone and beyond, and the increased risks of human trafficking are also taking a toll. And we also see that these conditions, whether in terms of the displaced, in terms of the reintegration of the soldiers, in terms of the harrowing situation that so many people have to confront, also takes a toll on women in terms of increased domestic violence and other conditions. But women aren't just victims, and that's the point I really want to make. They are tremendous agents for the kinds of work that needs to be critically done in their communities. They are also economic drivers, and I think investments need to be made. Small business is going to be critical, in addition to the things that you'll hear on the next panel. Small business drives economic growth. Women have to be equipped as entrepreneurs and have the kinds of needs that they need to be able to play a more vital role in that space met. And I think this is more than ever. It's always been an urgent situation in all the times I've been to Ukraine over the years, but it is particularly an urgent situation now as we look at early recovery and the kinds of needs that have been created by the crisis. Moreover, probably a well-kept secret, Ukraine has recently adopted a national action plan on women, peace, and security. And you ask, what is that about? Well, it responds to the United Nations Security Council resolution that has been longstanding for a decade plus now. The National Action Plan mirrors those that have been created by this country, NATO, and countless other countries, and acknowledges that women have a critical role to play in conflict resolution and reconciliation, in the kind of peace building that Ukraine needs and will urgently need even more in the days and weeks ahead. This plan must be more than a nice document. It needs to be fully implemented. It creates an enhanced sense of the urgency that is needed for women to be engaged at all levels of society, in leadership, and in their full participation. As we are also seeing that women are striving to de-escalate the violence in the ways that they can, many of the NGOs are involved in this to promote initiatives for peace and reconciliation. They're also carrying out assistance in very dangerous environments at grave personal risk, and they need to be understood as critical players in ways that that role has often not been recognized and supported in ways that it needs to be, so that they can be fully incorporated in building that better future of Ukraine that everyone wants to see. So let me just end where I started, which is moving the invisible to the visible in ways that really do affect people everywhere, and particularly in this country, to be motivated to do more, both in terms of our own government and in terms of what we can do individually and through organizations, because the strategic partnerships that this forum is all about need to be deepened and they need to be enhanced and they need to be flowering in even greater ways than so many have already done so far, so that truly Ukraine's best days will be ahead in that kind of flowering that each and every one of us wants to see, that the world needs to see, and certainly that the Ukrainian people deserve in all the ways that that can be manifested to help them in this very, very urgent period, moving through this humanitarian crisis, which is still very, very deep, to the kind of recovery, to the kind of efforts that need to be made economically, in terms of the reforms that need to be deepened, implemented fully, and in terms of contributing to that better future that the slideshow ended with.
I'm going to be speaking a little bit differently now. First of all, a lot of the humanitarian programs that I personally was involved in, and the organization I represent, the Ukrainian World Congress, and the NGO Patriot Defense in Ukraine was involved in more military projects. They were humanitarian projects for the military. We were providing training in first aid kits, medical kits. As a physician, I'm a little more pragmatic. We just heard from our other speakers what the very large problems are in Ukraine. Mostly they were speaking to the civilian population or the demobilized soldiers once they've come home. Today I decided to speak about evidence-based humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Sounds a little unusual. On the slide you see Mount Ventoux. In the 14th century, the Italian scholar ascended Mount Ventoux, Petrarch, and he ushered in the age of Renaissance. That led to a change in the way man saw his place in the world. It led to the Enlightenment, the time when reason took over, when there were more scientific rigor was important, when evidence-based medicine came into being, no longer superstitions, no longer magic, but evidence-based medicine. So what is evidence-based humanitarian aid? Again, best practices from past experiences instead of clinical judgment. The assessment of the needs, eyes-on evaluation on the situation on the ground, and then the patient's values the unique societal, culture, and psychological aspects in every society. Next slide. We'll talk about one program that used this evidence-based medicine and ended up being very successful as a model for others that could be just as successful. In February 2014, Russia invades Ukraine. The problem, the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation, expands into war in eastern Ukraine. Many of the Ukrainian patriots, the volunteers who went to the front line to fight for Ukraine, had no body armor and no life-saving first aid kits. It was unprepared for war. Next slide. Of course, the best treatment is prevention. If at that time there was victory, if at that time there was training for Ukrainian warfighters, if weapons were supplied by the West, if the US and other countries adhered to the Budapest Memorandum and performed their obligations, we wouldn't be sitting here talking right now. We'd be sitting in Kyiv helping rebuild Ukraine. Instead, we have what we have and we moved forward. Next slide. The Ukrainian World Congress did a medical assessment of the Ministry of Defense medical system. Next slide. And we found this. This was the appearance of aid given to the soldiers in the field. Next slide. These tents, dirt floors, for me as a radiologist, an X-ray machine outside in the sun, these were their operating rooms. Next slide. In the US and NATO countries, combat medicine looks like this. There's the golden hour, first aid on the field, self-aid buddy aid, a tactical medic takes care within an hour, takes care of the injured. They're then evacuated to a field hospital, a military hospital evacuation. In Ukraine at that time, the evacuation took 3 hours to 3 days before they were taken out, the injured were taken out to a tactical medic or seeing a doctor. You saw the appearance of the field hospitals. When they did get to the military hospital, they were getting the aid that they needed, but there's a very low level of rehabilitation in Ukraine. Next slide. So we decided to help. Instead of waiting for somebody else to come in, we decided to act immediately with the Ukrainian World Congress and an NGO named Patriot Defense. We decided to provide tactical medical training, specifically combat lifesaver courses, to the soldiers at the front lines and supply them with first aid kits, those items that could save their lives from catastrophic bleeding, from blocking of their airways, so that they lived long enough to make it to the doctors. Next slide. We established a humanitarian initiative to satisfy those specific needs. Next slide. We found international and local partners to work with. Next slide. We cooperated with local national Ukrainian organizations, governmental organizations, the security services, started the CLS training, and started distributing IFAKs. Next slide. The IFAK is a collection of simple items: a tourniquet, some hemostatic gauze, a nasopharyngeal tube, a chest seal, a needle to decompress a pneumothorax, a bandage. Relatively simple items, but you need to know what to do with them. Looking at them, as you all are now, you would probably not know what to do with each one of these items. Next slide. To fund it, we didn't wait for government funding, which we still haven't gotten from the United States, by the way. But we went to private individuals. We got contributions and grants from Australian and Canadian embassies, community organizations from around the world. Next slide. But we knew that it wasn't the kit that was important. As anybody who's in the military knows, it's the training that saves your life, not the actual equipment. Next slide. So we invited professional trainers that train US troops in Germany to come to Ukraine and train both Ukrainian troops and Ukrainian instructors, so that as quickly as possible we could spread this and not wait for just the foreign trainers to come in. Next slide. We translated the book on combat lifesaver courses into both Ukrainian and Russian languages. Next slide. And to date, we've trained over 25,000 soldiers, handed out 21,000 first aid kits, and trained about 4,500 cadets at various military institutes. A group of people consisting of 5 coordinators and 12 instructors. Next slide. We traveled all over Ukraine, from far east to far west, in the ATO zone at the training bases. Our instructors have traveled over 180,000 kilometers over the last 2 years. Next slide. We discovered that the soldiers were being saved at the point of injury, but they weren't making it to the hospitals because during evacuation, no care was being given to them. So we started a new course. In the fall of 2014, we started a long-range patrol medic course, next slide, where we trained special forces medics how to keep the patient alive long enough, the injured long enough to get them to a doctor. We've already trained 232 of these medics, and each one of them then receives a tactical medical backpack. Next slide. A year after we did our first assessment, we knew that things had changed in eastern Ukraine, so we updated the assessment. We traveled to 22 different points. Those are the local hospitals along the line of the ATO and 3 military hospitals, field hospitals that are located in that area, to assess what the status of these hospitals were. Currently, what ends up happening is the soldiers and civilians who are injured are first taken to these local hospitals, treated there, and then evacuated out further. So we went to see these hospitals to see what conditions there were at the hospitals and what kind of doctors, what kind of training they had. Next slide. As you see here, the conditions were not that much different than the field hospitals that we had seen the year before. These are operating rooms, these are their anesthesia machines. Next slide. Jury-rigged suction units. They were operating in rooms that definitely were not sterile, and they didn't have sterilization procedures. Next slide. And what we found was that the most important thing that was lacking was training. The doctors at these small local hospitals didn't know how to treat trauma. They didn't know how to treat gunshot wounds. They don't know how to treat shrapnel wounds. And they used to be family practice doctors. They took care of simple illnesses, and they don't have any trauma training. So we came up with another course, a Ukrainian Trauma Life Support course, a 6-day course teaching physicians, both military and non-military, how to treat trauma. Next slide. Our instructors started traveling to other countries to also get more and more experience on how to train the Ukrainian military. They traveled to Germany twice and trained with the U.S. Army. We have partnerships with the European Command Europe, with the Special Operations Command Europe. We've worked with the Canadian Embassy, the Australian Embassy when we were teaching the new Kyiv Patrol, the UK Assembly in Ukraine. And unfortunately, you don't see the U.S. Embassy on this list because to date, we have not yet received any support from the U.S. Embassy. We work with the Office of Defense Cooperation where we cooperate with them when they bring people in, but the U.S. Embassy hasn't given us any material or moral support. Next slide. We also decided to make this, to instill this tactical medicine, the idea of tactical medicine, the idea that every soldier's life has value, that each human being is a treasure and should be saved. We decided to instill this also into the cadets, the new officers that were being trained in the Ukrainian military academies and institutes. And the head of the Parliamentary Committee on Healthcare, Olha Bohomolets, helped us arrange so that we trained all of the new officers that were graduating from the military medical academies. Next slide. We had conferences. We had academic conferences. The first one was in January of 2015. Next slide. The next one was just last week. Tactical medicine in Ukraine. We brought together all the players, all of the different stakeholders that deal with tactical medicine in Ukraine. The first one was very well attended, and the Ukrainians stepped back and listened to the Americans and the Brits and the Canadians. On the second tactical medicine conference, the Ukrainians had more information and more experience than the foreigners. It was really interesting to see the difference because Ukraine is now currently in a war and they actually have more experience than the experts that came from outside of Ukraine. Next slide. We also signed memorandum of understanding with all of the different security services because I don't know if everybody's aware of this, but there are 12 different armies in Ukraine and each one of them has their own medical system. Next slide. And we gathered results. We found places where the IFAC was used, where the training was used, where it either saved life or it mitigated further injuries. Next slide. Donetsk Airport. Here we see a man with crushed legs from a blast wound. As you see, he has tourniquets on his legs. His life was saved. However, he did lose his legs and needed prosthetics. Next slide. We gathered actual data from the people who used, the soldiers who used the first aid kits or used the training to save their life or their buddy's life. Next slide. We talked to the chief medical officers of the different regiments and the different battalions who reported to us how the equipment was used and how the training was used. Next slide. We also had video evidence of how different units use the equipment and the training to save their life or to treat the patient, the injured, after the courses that we had provided for them. Next slide. So we did an assessment. We found out what the problem was. We moved forward with it, started working. We had a plan. We're continuing to expand the plan. And we're reevaluating constantly what we're doing to see if we're moving in the right direction or if we need to change something. Karl Popper wrote that we can learn through criticism of our mistakes and errors, especially through criticism by others, but eventually also through self-criticism. We should always look at what we're doing to see if we're doing the right thing and not think that just because we're doing it, that it is the right thing. We need to be sober about it. We need to be scientific about it and reevaluate as time goes on. What we had been doing in the ATO with training, we reevaluated and saw that we needed to change it after we did our second assessment. When we found that the initial saving of the life was being done, but they weren't living long enough to get to a doctor, we reevaluated what we were doing and we changed what we were doing. I think we should all do this, this kind of self-evaluation, look at our programs, make sure that we're doing the right thing. Also not assume that something that works in another country will work in Ukraine, because Ukraine has its own unique cultural, historical, and societal issues. Next slide.
Doctor, I'm going to have to ask you to
Okay, reality check. This would be
open it up to questions.
3 or 4 more slides. This is the reality check. These are the conditions in the ATO. A lot of people have been sending shiny white ambulances to Ukraine. Next slide. We don't need shiny white ambulances at the front lines. What we need are armored vehicles to evacuate the soldiers when they're injured, or the civilians when they're injured, when they're under fire. These are the vehicles we need. Next slide. This is the conditions in an emergency room in the West. These are the conditions that the Ukrainian doctors and medics are working under. Remember that. Next slide. This is the treatment that's being given. Prevention of disability, prevention of having to have a prosthetic by having tourniquet conversion, wound packing, and proper antibiotic treatment will work. Next slide. So that we don't see this kind of a result. Next slide. We should provide meaningful and effective humanitarian aid to Ukraine, such as these NGOs provide. Next slide. There's been many government programs that have come into Ukraine and provided aid. Many of them have done a good job, but they would benefit from, next slide, having interaction with the NGOs who have access to the ATO, which the government agencies do not, because they're not allowed to go there. There's trust. The civil society trusts NGOs more than it does government, and also the NGOs can provide oversight. NGOs have a streamlined, effective administration, which we know the government usually does not. Cooperation with all the security services, quick adaptability, conversion to civilian programs so that they're not simply military programs, and they can provide the evaluation of the effectiveness of the program to see if it actually is working. Next slide. Thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to questions.
We actually have a little bit more time, Oris told me. He's given us an extra 5 minutes if we...
I just want to say, the U.S. to date has contributed about $71 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Well, that's nice. It's not sufficient. And they've made no contribution yet this year, but I think with the president visiting, there'll probably something will be done. But it's something you might think about in telling your local legislators, that U.S. humanitarian assistance could be increased. It goes primarily through NGOs and through UN agencies, and has proved to be relatively effective, as you've heard from the doctor. She could use some more support too.
And those organizations use local implementers. They use local NGOs to deliver that assistance, NGOs that are able to travel in across the line of contact in occupied areas. But they also face restrictions in the separatist areas that are limiting the activities of non-governmental organizations. Please.
You mentioned several times that, unfortunately, U.S. Embassy did not help your organization, and some other embassies did. What help did you expect to get? I'm just curious to know, because we know that the U.S. government is helping Ukraine in many ways. Just that's my question, because I want to clarify.
I can tell you that the principal organizations we have working in the country, USAID, the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, PRM, Populations, Refugees and Migration Bureau, the State Department, do not fund military programs, even military programs that help soldiers. I'm not sure what the situation is in terms of our Department of Defense and what cooperation or assistance they present, but it probably is not through NGOs. But I'll let you answer your...
Oh, it works. Good. Yes, those are constraints that were put on by the United States government. And when it comes to the Department of Defense, they have insisted to us over and over again that they cannot work through NGOs, which I find quite questionable, since I know that they work through NGOs in other countries like Afghanistan and Iraq. But they are trying to provide this sort of direct military aid to Ukraine. They have trainers that have come in, soldiers that have come in and done training in Yavoriv and in other military training bases for Ukrainian soldiers. However, just to give you an example, the first aid kit, I have an example of one if somebody wants to come see it later. The improved first aid kit that we buy at the prices that an NGO can get is $89 American, a combination of some stuff that we buy in Ukraine and some in the United States. The same kit was priced at $250 when it's provided by the U.S. military. So we could provide almost 3 kits for every one, just because we're an NGO and we can get different prices. We can also provide training with the kids. The U.S. military has been able to provide training, and then because we were working with Special Operations Command Europe, they asked us to come and help them provide the training for the Ukrainian Special Forces units when they came to do tactical medical mentoring. We provided the translators. Our instructors came as translators because most of them speak both English and Ukrainian. Our instructors are Ukrainians. The Department of Defense asked our organization to provide the IFACs for the soldiers that they were teaching because they were unable to provide the IFACs because of the constraints that had been put on them by the DoD. At this point, there's a rule that the military cannot cross the Dnipro River and go anywhere east. So they can only stay west of the Dnipro River, west of Kyiv. And also they have to travel in groups of 4. Because apparently Lviv is a very dangerous city and U.S. soldiers can't take care of themselves alone and they have to have groups of 4. So there's all these constraints that are being put on that are really false constraints. And I think one of the problems is it's because it's being put on from here. They're not listening to the embassy and they're not listening to what's actually happening on the ground. We don't have a lot of interaction with the embassy. We have more interaction with the Office of Defense Cooperation of the embassy, and then partially with the Special Operations Command Europe and the European Command, the military side.
My question is a little politics speaking. Now that Putin is moving his forces out of Syria, how is it going to be affecting in Ukraine? And it's number one question. And number two, what are the plans for the next several years for Ukraine? Because, as you know, there is still lots of help needed. Thank you.
I can't speculate what Mr. Putin's plans are, and this is a humanitarian panel, not a security panel. I think the commitment to Ukraine will continue to be strong, particularly from Congress. We need that commitment of increased resources to help meet that UN humanitarian appeal that I mentioned at the beginning of our panel. $71 million is a substantial investment by the United States, but it's inadequate in terms of the size of the problem that we have in Ukraine and the needs of humanitarian needs of the Ukrainian people. If anyone else wants to.
I just want to say that obviously nobody can get inside Mr. Putin's head and what malevolence he will engage in next. But one hope coming out of stabilizing the situation in Syria would be to relieve the pressure of the refugees that are constantly visible in terms of the impact on Europe. And if that could be lessened, obviously, there could be much more attention, and should be because of the magnitude of the situation in Ukraine. So I think it's also a matter of constantly to just keep these issues out there so that there would be the attempt to do the kinds of things that are clearly, evidently, very much evidently needed.
I just wanted to conclude a couple of things. I want to repeat the need for the international community to step up and provide the resources that the UN and other international agencies and NGOs need to respond to the humanitarian crisis. $298 million is needed conservative. That's a conservative estimate this year, 2016. There are things the government of Ukraine can do, and people have mentioned them here. Better coordination among all the agencies that operate on humanitarian issues. A proactive, transparent, and positive response to re-registering displaced persons who have lost their pensions and social benefits. Yes, there may be fraud out there, but there has to be, they must lean into helping these people reestablish their pensions and their other payments. Improving and streamlining the procedures for crossing that line of contact is very important. It creates a humanitarian problem. It prevents people from getting the health care they need. It may place them in danger because of the developing security situation. And they have property and family, and some of them claim their pensions by crossing that line of contact or are employed by crossing the line of contact. And finally, let's not forget the problems the separatists are causing in the occupied territories. They are not observing international humanitarian law. They are obstructing the work of NGOs. They are refusing the operations of groups like UN agencies because they fail to sign on to documentation that would legitimize these organizations. So there's something that we should be putting, we, the international community, should be putting pressure on these alleged People's Republic of Luhansk and Donetsk. Finally, I ask the audience and organizations to consider making a donation, a humanitarian donation. Best not done in kind. As the doctor said, they don't need fancy white ambulances. They don't need boots, and they need money. Money can be given to the NGOs. There's a website, www.interaction.org. You can make a contribution that lists all of the NGOs and private groups operating in Ukraine, and they can use the money much more effectively and use it to respond to the real needs of Ukrainian people.
I just want to think, there are 140 Ukrainian organizations working with the UN, and you can find that at OCHA.Ukraine. It lists the organizations that are operating and the kinds of programs that they're doing. But finally, I think the government of Ukraine should remove its restrictions on the commercial shipments of food and medicines into the non-government controlled area. That is a violation of international humanitarian law, which exists to preserve the lives and well-being of people. And I would urge people who talk to the government and government officials to press that issue. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today.
And I wanted to say one last thing, that please also urge the international community to support Ukraine's right for a sovereign, free, and territorial integrity of their own country. Because if that had been done from the very beginning, we wouldn't all be sitting here talking about the humanitarian crisis. And yes, we need to help with the humanitarian crisis, but let's not forget what caused this humanitarian crisis. And let's also encourage our international community, our own government, to support Ukraine's rights as a European sovereign nation. Thank you.